and welcome to episode 1 of This Is What Came Out of Me, a semi-regular podcast about anything and everything, but mostly pop culture from movies, TV, podcasts, and YouTube. Each week, or whenever it is that I get to post, I'll talk about things that have grabbed my interest and things that I think you out there in the ether might be interested in. I'm SierraKiloBravo. Let's get into it. First of all, let's have a talk about podcasts. The nature of my work means that I get to listen to many different podcasts during the day, and as a result, I've found that over time, my subscription list has grown to around about 50. The list is diverse. I've got podcasts that cover history, comedy, conspiracies, news, deconstruction, and things like that. Now, I need to make it clear that I don't necessarily agree with all of the things that are discussed on the podcast that I listen to, but I believe in listening to and reading a wide range of points of view. I believe that it really helps to expand your mind and to understand my fellow riders on this rock flying through space that we call Earth, in this wild ride that we call life. Now, I've got my favourites and I've got my must-listens. And I want to talk to you today about a few episodes that leapt out and grabbed me. Some episodes that really got my interest. The first one is Joe Rogan. You've probably heard of him. He's been on my list of subscriptions, probably the longest out of all of the subscriptions that I have. Now, I don't listen to all of the episodes of Joe, but for example, some of the hunting ones that he has, they don't really interest me. But I've got to say, he's having a pretty stellar year so far as guests go. Now, a really good example of this was in the last week or so when he had two gentlemen by the name of Jeff Evans and Bud Brutzman on. The episode description says that Jeff Evans is an adventurer, an expedition leader, a high-altitude medic, physician assistant, speaker, facilitator, and TV personality. Bud Brutzman is a television show creator, executive producer, and he's known for TV shows such as Overhaulin', Rides, and King of the Cage. I've got to be honest, I hadn't heard of either of these guys before the podcast, but I was honestly one of the best podcasts I've listened to in a very long time. Brutzman was pretty quiet throughout the podcast, but that was kind of good in a way because it allowed Evans to hold the floor. And man, I got to say, this guy has got some stories. It was quite honestly very riveting listening. His stories about Mount Everest and doing rescues on there were great, as were his stories about being a medic in Iraq. And he's got a really... how do I put this? He's got a really nice voice. He's pretty easy to listen to. And again, to be honest, the podcast was about 2 hours long, and I could have very easily listened for another 2 hours, no trouble at all. I highly recommend this episode if you want to find that. So those names again were Jeff B. Evans and Bud Brutzman, just from in the last week on the Joe Rogan Experience. Now, another one that Joe's had in the last few days was a gentleman who goes by the name of Sargon of Akkad. I'm not quite sure how to say that. Now, this was huge. It was 4 hours long. It was an epic chat, and the guys ranged over a number of different topics like VidCon, social justice warriors, ancient civilizations. They seemed to cover a whole huge range of things during their chat. Now, I've never really listened to Sargon before, but he seems like a pretty intelligent guy, and while they talked about all these different subjects, he seemed pretty comfortable while talking about them. It was really good how Joe challenged him on a number of things, and yeah, overall, even though it was huge, it was 4 hours long, as I said, it was a pretty good listen, pretty good way to pass the time, and I learned a few things along the way. An honourable mention, I guess, from the last couple of weeks was Judd Apatow. You might know him more as a director, but the episode with Judd mainly talked about his comedy career and was a pretty good listen. If you haven't listened to the Joe Rogan podcast before, then I certainly recommend you have a listen. Like me, you might not listen to all of the episodes, but if you see a familiar name there as a guest, then I recommend that you check it out. He's just got a knack of being a really good conversationalist. So moving on to another podcast, another one I listened to is called the H3 Podcast, and they this week had a guest who goes by the name of Boogie2988. You might not have heard of this gentleman before, but he is a internet personality. He's been around on YouTube for a number of years. Like Sargon of Akkad, Boogie2988 was someone that I had heard of, but someone that I'd never listened to or watched on YouTube. He's an internet personality and he's been around for a number of years, but for whatever reason, I'd never actually listened to him talk or watched any of his videos. But all I can say about this is that I listened for 2.5 hours to this guy talk with Ethan and Hela on the H3 podcast. I listened to 2.5 hours of a guy that I knew nothing about, and I was absolutely drawn in the whole time. He just seemed so warm. He had some funny and sad stories to share. It was just really easy to listen to. And what I really liked in particular was that even though Boogie2988 struggles quite severely with anxiety, Ethan and Hela, the hosts, did a really good job of gently prodding him and letting conversation flow. Another good one from recent times on the H3 podcast was the Steve-O episode. This is, of course, Steve-O from Jackass. He's been having a little bit of a renaissance of late, and he spent his time on the podcast talking about his life, his drug issues, and that renaissance he's getting into stand-up comedy of late. So that was also a pretty good one, especially if, like me, you grew up watching Jackass. One of my other must-listens that comes across my subscription list each week is called Tiger Belly, and that's with a comedian by the name of Bobby Lee, and also on the podcast is his girlfriend Kalila and their co-hosts Gilbert and George. Now, this podcast is always hilarious, it always goes off the rails, and this week was absolutely no different at all. Ari Shaffir, a well-known comedian, was the guest this week, and like I said, it was pretty hilarious. And let's just say that towards the end, there was a thing that happened that meant that after the podcast was initially posted, they had to take it down, edit it, and then repost it. And what did that involve? Well, I'm not going to give too much away, but it did involve a chocolate bar and a certain part of Bobby's anatomy. Completely unplanned, but it happened nonetheless. Now, Ari Shaffir, he was a good guest on the podcast, and I've listened to him on a few other podcasts, like Your Mum's House was another one I've heard him on recently. And he is a good guest, and I enjoy listening to him when he is a guest. But there's something interesting about Ari Shaffir, in my opinion, and that is that when he is a guest, he's really funny, and he's really good to listen to. But on his own podcast, on Skeptic Tank, the podcast that he runs, for whatever reason, for who knows why, I've never really been able to get into it, and I don't know why. It's happened with some other people as well, where I found them to be a really good guest, but their own podcast I've really struggled to listen to. I don't know why that is. Maybe it's just they feel a bit more free when they're visiting other people's podcasts, and maybe they feel like they have to stick to a certain plan when they're on their own podcast. The Nerdist is another podcast that I have on my list. It's a pretty popular one. It's not one that I listen to every single episode of, but this week Will Ferrell was a guest, and Will Ferrell is one of my favourite comedic actors, so that was definitely worth a listen. He was, as expected, completely hilarious, so that's worth a listen if you are interested in tracking that down. Moving on to the Ghetto Funk podcast. This is a music podcast, in case you couldn't guess from the name. They made a release after a long break. If you like funk and jazz, a bit of old school hip hop beats and things like that, then this is a good one to have a listen to. Fun fact on this one, I was quite pleasantly surprised to hear a band called Cookin' on Three Burners open the show and play behind the intro. The reason that caught my interest is that they are a band from my hometown here of Melbourne in Australia. So that's a good one to have a listen to. Some good songs on that in this latest release. And lastly, I just want to have a talk about one of my favourite must-listens, and that's called No Agenda. This was, as usual, outstanding. The hosts, Adam Curry and John C. Dvorak, they've been in the media for many years, and twice a week they sit down and deconstruct the news. I find them to be a really great team, and even though the podcast runs for 3 hours each time, the time just flies by as you go down a rabbit hole of fake news, media lies, scandals, and reality checks. I'll talk about this one a little bit more next time that I make a post, but if you like well-researched breakdowns of the news and current topics, then I absolutely highly recommend that you check it out. So let's change direction now and talk about movies. Now, it's fair to say that I really love movies. In fact, I watched 160 movies last year. That's how how high my level of love is for movies. So in brief, here's some of the trailers that I watched in the last week or so, and a super brief review of them. First up was The Foreigner. Jackie Chan and Pierce Brosnan. Yes, please. This looks great. It's classic Jackie Chan action in a modern setting. Looks like Pierce Brosnan might be the bad guy. It just looks great. I think I'm going to be all over that when it comes out. Next up was Pitch Perfect 3. Now, I haven't seen the other two, but I've got a little bit of a soft spot for Anna Kendrick, so decided to check this one out. And, well, yeah, look, there's not really much there to make me want to watch it, so maybe that might be something I watch one day when it comes out on Netflix or DVD. Lastly, there's a new Miles Teller movie coming called Thank You for Your Service. Now, I'm not usually a huge Miles Teller fan, but this actually looks pretty good. It looks like it switches between Iraq or Afghanistan and America, and it might be about PTSD or something like that. Not sure, but it does look really interesting. Whatever the case, I think I will check this one out when it's released. So that's all for trailers, but before we finish talking about movies, I want to tell you about a really good one that we watched on Netflix here in Australia. It's called Stalingrad. It's a 2013 film about the Russians retaking Stalingrad from the Germans during World War II. It focuses mainly on 5 soldiers and a young girl who find themselves thrown together in a last stand in the city. The soldiers are holed up in an apartment block where the young girl lives. It's a great story, and the action scenes are really intense, if a little overdone with slow motion, but still intense nonetheless. What I particularly liked about the movie was seeing the German army in action. It might seem like a bit of a weird thing to say, but usually in war movies you only ever see the Germans as side characters that are there to be mown down by the heroic Allied forces. But in this film, their side make up a really good portion of the runtime, and the battle scenes take a view from both sides, from the Russians and the Germans at the same time. So that was something that I thought made it a little bit different to movies that you normally see. Overall, it was a very well put together movie. Now, speaking of World War II, I'm reading a fantastic book at the moment called Hellstorm by a gentleman by the name of Thomas Goodrick. Honestly, this is the best book I've read about World War II, and it's probably right up there with being one of the best books overall that I've read. It mainly covers the last few years of the war as Germany lost ground to the Allies to the east and the Russians to the west. Now, I'm not going to lie, I've got to be upfront about this. The book is brutal. It's a really brutal book that holds nothing back about the rape, torture, murder, and horror that happened as Germany fell apart. I've read a lot of war books, and this is the first time that really raw side of what happened to the civilians has come across my consciousness. Some of the things that it talks about are just simply awful, and I think it's really important for people to know what happened, because you never really hear about that side of things. You see war, yes. You see people die, yes. But it's often presented with heroics or some sort of moral message. Even books and movies that look at the dark side of war, they don't really go so deep. But this book, it really lays it all out. It never glorifies or tries to explain it away. It just reports from eyewitnesses exactly what happened. There's no such thing as a good war, that's for sure. I haven't even finished reading the book yet, but I absolutely recommend it 100%. So let's move on to YouTube now. You may or may not know that I am a vlogger, so I spend quite a bit of time on YouTube. In fact, since at our house we don't have normal TV because our satellite dish points at a tree, a large percentage of our entertainment comes from YouTube and the internet. My two favourite vloggers are Casey Neistat and Crispy Shorts, both masters at what they do and inspirations for the admittedly terrible vlogs that I make. Casey posted 2 vlogs this week, and I don't know, they just seem to lack his usual magic. The first was his incredible Lufthansa first class review featuring Wesley Snipes, which, while interesting and hit all the usual Casey marks, it just felt a little forced. It didn't seem to have that spark that his earlier viral $23,000 first class flight video had. The other one that he released was kind of a half vlog of behind the scenes of the Samsung ad that he shot recently in France. Awesome location, some great visuals in there, but again, it just seemed to feel like it was a case of here's a bunch of stuff I shot and threw together rather than a properly constructed vlog. It just didn't seem to have that usual flow that we've come to expect from Casey. Crispy Shorts, on the other hand, well, this dude was on fire this week. He really, honestly is one of my favourite vloggers. He's been away from New York this week, where he lives, and he's been posting from places such as Malibu and San Diego. The travel vlogs are always fun, and in this case, he's away with the lads, with his mates, and he seems to be having a pretty good time while he's away. He even went to SpaceX, so I'm pretty jealous about that. What I really like about Crispy Shorts is that he posts daily, and he keeps his videos to around 5 or 6 minutes, which makes them easily digestible. Crispy Shorts is such a part of my day that his latest upload is the very first thing that I watch when I get home at night. So to conclude, I want to talk about television. Does Netflix count as TV? I'm not sure. I guess it does. It does in my world. Like I said earlier, our satellite dish points at a tree, so all our entertainment comes from online. Last week we finished Bloodline and thoroughly enjoyed it. Highly recommend that one if you want to have a good family murder mystery in your eye holes. So this week with Bloodline finished, we started a new show called El Chapo. El Chapo is a drug lord from the 1990s through to recent times where he made news when he escaped from prison. Now, being about Mexican drug cartels, you can't help but compare this show to Narcos, another excellent Netflix show. But the difference here is that whereas Narcos was focused on the DEA and Pablo Escobar's sides, so far, El Chapo is looking mostly at his side and his rise from being a delivery boy to being a boss within the cartels. We're 3 episodes in so far, and we're really enjoying it, and we'll keep watching through the whole first season, which is, I think, 9 episodes in total. It's not quite as polished as Narcos. For example, the editing and some of the wigs that the actors are wearing are pretty hilarious. But it's definitely worth a look, especially if you like these kinds of stories and if you enjoyed Narcos. It's a good follow-up series. Yeah, even if you listen to it just for the really cool samba-esque theme song, then I think you'll be pretty happy with it. Well, that's all for this time. I hope you enjoyed it. Check out the notes for links to the various things that I've covered today. I really love talking about the kinds of things that I've talked about today. So feel free to leave a comment and let's keep the conversation going. Until next time, I'm SierraKiloBravo, and this is what came out of me.